For the George Mason University Parents of the Field project, I'm happy to share interview duties with Bill Potopchik. I'm John Stevens at UNC at Chapel Hill. Bill?
And I'm Bill Potopchik. I'm a principal at the Community Building Institute and also teach at George Mason University at the Carter School.
And our parent of the field today is Chris Carlson. And I'll start off by asking Chris, please tell us about your early career and what led you into the field of dispute resolution in the public sector.
Not so nice to be with you too. I think, in contrast to many people, my career started out as a nurse, and then I got very involved in the environmental movement in the late 60s and 70s, and I was actively involved in advocacy on environmental issues at the local, state, and national level, and decided that I needed a different credential. And I went to law school, started law school when I was 40. And essentially, in the course of being in law school, I read an article by Gail Bingham in a magazine, and she was talking about the use of mediation and resolving environmental conflicts. I was clerking for a very large law firm that was on the defendant side of things, shall we say. And I realized the kinds of resources that could be thrown at keeping things from happening. And that led me to look at the field of negotiation and mediation. And and that led me to eventually to the Kettering Foundation when I graduated from law school.
Chris, that's fascinating. And so when you talk about looking at the field of negotiation, mediation, what you saw in those days is much different than what we see now. Can you talk about who were some of the folks you turned to learn about the field or where you studied, and what you learned from them?
I started out in the area of law, and I took a comparative law class about how the Japanese were dealing with environmental law. And in Japanese society, they were using mediated approaches because they're a more homogeneous society, and I saw how that worked. My own experience had been in the rough and tumble of American political life. And so I guess that what I looked at in terms of resources were what was happening with, well, I remember the Storm King mediation, which was one of the first ones. I looked at the other kinds of efforts that had been made to address public issues. At the same time, what was happening way back then was there was a growing movement in the field of community mediation. There was a growing movement in the legal field. And then this area in what we called, and at that time it was almost called environmental mediation, were the areas that were actively, people were being actively engaged in. And so I was following the work of, I think, Gail Bingham, Larry Susskind, and some others. And that's when I encountered some of the work at the Kettering Foundation and got interested in what they were doing. And of course, that was nearby where I was living at the time. So
Sure.
So building on that, to give us at least a little bit of the knitting, you learned a little bit about comparative in law school. You were seeing the differences of resources and methods. What drew you specifically to the Kettering Foundation, and then tell us a bit about your work there, please.
Well, the Kettering Foundation at that time had a strong program in urban policy, and they had a project going on called the Negotiated Investment Strategy. And the idea there was that in terms of the delivery of urban policy, that federal and state government had a tremendous impact on what was happening at the local level. And yet there was no coordination or communication about what the local agenda was. It was all the national agenda or the state agenda being pushed down. And so the Kettering Foundation decided that it would be interesting to try to bring players from the federal, state, and local government together in cities to see if they could negotiate out a negotiated investment strategy in that city and that city's priorities. And so it turned out that there was at that time, the federal government was organized around federal regions. And the region that was in the Midwest was the one that took this idea up and was willing to participate. And so 3 communities were chosen: Columbus, Ohio, Gary, Indiana, and St. Paul, Minnesota. And then 3 mediators were engaged with very different backgrounds. Larry Susskind was engaged in Columbus. Jim Lowy, a sociologist, was engaged in Gary, Indiana. And Bill Usry, who was an old labor mediator, was engaged for the St. Paul, Minnesota NIS. And then after that first generation of the uses of the strategy, which were fairly successful efforts, we began to branch out and look at other places where this model could be applied. And I was engaged in that effort.
I remember reading in an evaluation report from RAND about the first 3 NIS that this was the most implemented innovation ever up until that point in time. How did that give steam to the kind of work you and colleagues were doing elsewhere?
Well, I think it really brought home 2 things: that it made a lot of sense to bring people to the table to pursue some mutual goals and objectives. Mm-hmm. I think at the same time we realized that the table needed to be expanded to include other sectors. And so, for instance, one of the next uses was in Connecticut, and there it was the state government, local governments, and the nonprofit service providers around the allocation of social services block grants. And so, you began to see the need to include other sectors beyond government. And that had arisen in part in Gary, Indiana, where for a variety of reasons, it was important to include the private sector. In that case, I think that one of the steel companies was really going to the legislature and affecting what was happening in terms of the state policy towards Gary. And so they were an important adjunct, and we recognized then that other actors beyond government needed to be at the table.
Mm-hmm. What I always admired about the first approach to NIS, and you said it as you described it to us, there were very different mediators engaged. Larry and Jim and Bill came out of 3 different parts of the field. They were different personalities, and yet they all worked. What did that begin to teach you about the different kinds of approaches to mediation and public dispute resolution that were instructive for you moving forward?
Well, I think that for me, the things that really came through are that the context is really important. And all of this was occurring in a political context. And all of these mediators had experience in the political context, some more than others. And I think that showed. But I think that the other thing, and I wanted to mention this, is that because I was reflecting on the kinds of sort of approaches that I learned about over time that influenced my own, mental map of how things need to happen. And that is, Mayor Dugan's nested model of conflict,
Yep.
where essentially you have to be able to deal with the kind of conflict that occurs between people, the interpersonal conflict. You have to be able to understand the way conflicts occur naturally in organizational contexts. You have to understand how they occur, in the system, the larger systemic context. All experience with all of those elements is important. And it reinforces how multidisciplinary this field is. To be an effective practitioner, you have to have skills at these different levels.
Chris, from that work, you broadened, at least from the vantage point I had in the field, and you began to work on state offices of dispute resolution and sort of the expansion of this work in a variety of different venues and partners and so forth. Can you talk about your work in putting together the Ohio Commission on Dispute Resolution and what you learned and what kind of role you think that played in the field?
Okay, I will talk about that, and I'll step back one step because, in the development of the field in the mid 80s, I think it was, or early 80s, the Ford Foundation and some other foundations funded something called the National Institute for Dispute Resolution.
Yep.
And essentially they looked at what was going on in the late 60s and 70s and thought we needed more of an institutional kind of framework for these activities to go on. And so they asked 3 people to sort of help them think about that. And that was Larry Susskind, Sandy Jaffe, who'd been at the Ford Foundation for a long time, and me. I was at the Kettering Foundation by then. And so we consulted with states. They were offering matching grants to states to start these programs. And so I was very involved in conversations and consultations with various states as they developed their approaches to seeking grants from NIDR to get things off the ground. And then Ohio, I'd been working with some people in Ohio around how to build that capacity in Ohio, and served on the governor of Ohio at the time set up a task force on peacemaking and conflict resolution, and I served on that group. And as
Was that Governor Celeste?
Pardon me? That was Governor
Celeste?
Celeste, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I served on that, and legislation came out of that was supported by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court as well as Governor Celeste. Chief Justice happened to be a Republican, and the legislation passed, and it created the Ohio Commission on Dispute Resolution and Conflict Management. And then I was asked to apply to be the director of that, and I did that. And it had a very broad charge because we were, the statute essentially provided us with money to seed dispute resolution programs in courts, communities, schools, and in public agencies. So over the course of the 7 years that I was in that role, we worked in that broad kind of way to establish capacity in the state and to build the leadership that would support those kinds of programs.
Let's build on that because, Chris, you I see you as a parent of the field in terms of that institution building, especially in this public policy and programs area. So say a bit more, please, about other state offices. Of course, you were helping colleagues in a variety of states with their work, and what you, as Bill implied, what you were able to get out of, or maybe encountered some challenges in terms of directing the Ohio efforts.
Well, you know, it was really interesting to see where these programs sprang up, and it was very important to pay attention to that, because some of the, and you know, it's never programs, it's always people, isn't it? And so where the idea would catch on with people had a lot to do with how successful the program ultimately was. So in some states, it was somebody in the court system that saw the potential. In some states, it was somebody in state government that saw the potential. In some places, it was in the university, and it was primarily those three venues. And over, you know, so initially, as I mentioned, NIDR had this seed money to leverage investments from the states, and so that got the programs off the ground. But then to sustain them required that there was a champion for the program within that institution, whether it was the courts, state government, or universities. And some of the programs, well, I'll talk about Ohio. I'll talk very specifically about Ohio, because about a year after the commission began, there was a gubernatorial election, and a governor of another party, actually it was Governor Voinovich, was the new governor, and he came into office, and not surprisingly, a new agency and government budgets were being cut, and so they decided his budget eliminated the commission. But we had a champion. At that time, we had the Chief Justice, who had supported the legislation, and we had both the President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, who the commission was appointed by the governor, the Chief Justice, the Speaker of the House, the President of the Senate. So we had three of the four who said, let's keep on doing this. And so it got back in the budget, and then I met Governor Voinovich's team, and they agreed that it could continue, and we worked very effectively with the Voinovich administration. But that only goes to prove the point that these kinds of programs, I think, need a champion if they're going to survive in an institutional setting, and that's where most of them were.
That's really interesting. Chris, you used a phrase there that I'd like to explore with you. You talked about people who saw the potential. In my mind, you were the person who was always articulating the potential. What was the potential public value of doing this work and moving in this direction? How do you articulate the potential of public dispute resolution? And I would note that as you think about that you were very good at shifting the message. Like, what does a mayor need to hear, and how is that different from a state legislator, different from a community activist, different from somebody from the Supreme Court? So how can you talk about the potential and then how it shifted a bit for different audiences?
I do think that, and this is just, common sense, that you have to understand where people are and approach them from where they are. And if I have a critique of the field, I think it is not recognizing that the centrality of leaders in this kind of work. and that making the appeal to them, framing it in a way that they can understand, and I don't mean by that pandering in any way. I mean, when this field of public policy work is set in a political context, there, there's no getting rid of conflict in politics.
No.
That's what it's about. But you don't frame it as just out and out conflict. You frame it as, so how are you going to deal with this issue? How are you going to move through this issue? How are you going to get allies? How are you going to, get people to see your side of things? All those kinds of things are really important. And I can't help but move to the present right now because we're in a time of high political conflict. And but yet it is still, leaders still want to get things done. Most leaders still want to get things done. And so it's important to talk with them about how this can help them get things done.
So, Chris, again, let's keep on your arc of work and institution building and seeding. That 7 years at the Ohio Commission on Dispute Resolution and Conflict Management. As I like to say, I joined you. You hired me to be part of that team, and I happily tell folks that the name of this agency itself was a compromise, because I remember you telling me that Dick Celeste really wanted peace in the title, and the Chief Justice said that would not fly. So I like to say that even the Commission on Dispute Resolution had its own dispute related to the naming. But then you also then created the Policy Consensus Initiative. Could you please talk about that and any other steps between those two homes for your work?
Well, the way the Policy Consensus Initiative came about was that the National Institute for Dispute Resolution had been around for about 10 years. I can't remember exactly how long it was, but the Ford Foundation was not going to continue to support that. And the Hewlett Foundation had taken a growing interest in it. And we recognized that these were very young, nascent operations, and that in order to continue to add states and build the capacity of the existing programs, there needed to be some infrastructure to do that. And so NIDR had supported the state offices meeting together regularly, and they supported this effort to try to find a way to make the bridge to an organization that would continue to work on building the capacity. And so we wrote a proposal to the Hewlett Foundation. Well, interestingly enough, at the same time that we were submitting a proposal to Hewlett, now I may miss the name of the group, but there was a national association. It was Council of Governors Policy Advisors, and so they were a national organization of the chiefs of staff or chief policy people for the governors. They submitted a proposal. And so Hewlett said, let's put that together. And so they created they said, if you will bring in the leader aspect with the practitioner aspect, we will support that. And that's how we began. And so our board was made up of governors, legislators, and organizations that represented state leaders, like the Council of State. What is that? CSG.
Council of State Governments?
Yeah, Council of State Governments. Regional associations of governors and people who were the directors of these offices. And our role was to work with leaders in states to build the capacity within the state to address public issues. And I started to say public conflicts, but it's very interesting that what has happened in the development of the field is to open it up to look at all the ways from uh, all the kinds of collaborative approaches to addressing policy problems.
So it sounds again you were a leader for trying to support the shifting infrastructure for how to have these conflict resolution and consensus building methods become more regular, more embedded in various state level kinds of work. Again, say a bit more about that work at the Policy Consensus Initiative, and then again, another Chris Carlson brainstorm, looking to universities again and the formation of the University Network for Collaborative Governance.
Well, so we get started and we're working to try to get these kinds of programs off the ground in states. And what we see as we look around is we're examining what are the barriers that we're encountering to do that. And we looked at that issue very seriously because about that time as the foundation money went away, the NIDR was no longer on the scene. And I think that I remember that there was a recession or something in the early part of the 90s. All of a sudden, programs were foundering, and so we began to look at what it takes to make a program successful and effective, and we saw that the transition that was happening was that some programs were moving into universities. I can think of two in particular, Oregon and Massachusetts. And it was partly because as administrations changed, it wasn't always possible to find a champion within the state government. And we were focused on the public policy kinds of conflicts. So universities in some instance stepped forward to do that. So we began to make a more concerted effort to reach out to universities. And we had on our board the chancellor of the Cal State system at that time. And we also worked closely with Bill Ruckelshaus because he had started centers at both University of Wyoming and Washington, UW and Washington State. So we we employed those two people to speak to university leadership. Sort of starting at the top. But then we also tried to reach through some of the, one of you is going to have to help me. ASPA is
American Society for Public Administration is at least one ASPA. There may be another. Go ahead.
And so we were reaching into those communities because the area of public administration obviously is one where they're, training people to go out and serve in government. And so would they be interested in starting a program like this? Many of them had some public service component of their state university program. And so that leads me to UNCG because at that time there was an organization, I think it's still around, there was an organization called the Southern Growth Policies Board, and they had formed a university public service network, and it was called SCUPSO, Southern, is that right, John?
Yes.
John?
Southern Consortium of University Public Service Organizations.
And so we looked at that as a potential model for something that Policy Consensus Initiative might get off the ground that would help strengthen university programs through sharing knowledge and helping them build the capacity of their endeavors.
Bill and I have hit on at least what we've had some direct contact with you on, with early on with NIS, with Kettering, with the Ohio Commission, with the Policy Consensus Initiative, and UNCG. Are there other pieces about your path in terms of seeding and supporting institutions that you want to make sure that we capture?
Say a word more, John, about that.
Well, I think for one piece, certainly one part of your work in Ohio with the Ohio Commission was the court system and also Ohio State Law School, which I know you have a continuing relationship over a long time. And of course, there's been those pieces about some law schools doing some more of that public outreach or serving as that home. Although, again, they as an institution usually have a different mindset than the multi-stakeholder, very messy politics kind of settings for conflict resolution.
Well, I guess you're always looking for allies, aren't you? and looking for potential for the potential for synergies, and I just think that it probably goes back to the work I did at the Kettering Foundation, where you're really scanning the landscape for ways in which this is such a multidisciplinary field that there are ways that programs can intersect that will benefit the whole. I'm afraid that's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's the best I can do.
Well, I think that's fine. And of course, all through this time, you, through your mayor's network with the League of Cities, with regional councils, with all kinds of other partners. So wherever you were, as you said, you were looking for those opportunities and synergies. Bill caught that earlier. Always looking to show how the door can open for a different way to address public issues that get to reasonable forms of problem solving within the nature of politics or partisan division as well.
Yeah, and I would say that was, we made a very concerted effort to reach out to both state and local government associations, the National League of Cities, the National Conference of State Legislatures, and other organizations. We did a lot of work with NCSL over the years. Because it's really important to keep the lines of communication open and working with the people who are in policy-making positions who are facing these kinds of public issues all the time.
So, Chris, to step back, how did you see the hopes and the dreams of the field across your career? You know, because I think for all of us who've been in the field for a while, there have been some really big visions, there's some very practical visions, so on and so forth. And you're exploring that with the different institutional partnerships and arrangements that you've talked about. Do you think the hopes and visions of the field have shifted, and how would you describe that?
I do think they have. I think they've gotten much more realistic. You know, I think it started out there. We really thought we had the answer for every problem, and I think that one of my criticisms is that I do think that there were people who felt that the intervening role, the role of the intervener, the facilitator or mediator, was the most important person in the room, and I don't think that was a helpful thing. Because I think that we work more effectively when we work with leaders, put them in the convening role, and then it seems to me that if the process is conducted effectively, they are in a position to carry things through where we are not. So I think that's one thing where I think that the people who've done the people in programs who've been most effective have been the ones who have effectively engaged leaders, I believe. I think it's a terribly important thing to acknowledge the role they can play as conveners. I mean, it's just always astounded me. I've certainly learned this early on, that if you got leaders to uh, take the initiative on something and put them up front, how that kept things, in a way, kept things moving. They could bring people to the table and keep them there.
I have a follow-up on that, Bill. So some colleagues and I at least like to use the term facilitative leadership. Of course, there's lots of different leadership models. And I know this may be hard with especially more recent events and people looking at the national divisions. But do you think we have a foothold for facilitative leaders at the state and local level as you look back at your effort to make that happen?
Well, it can be pretty discouraging right now when we're in this era of very partisan division. But I just, based on my own experience of working with policymakers, I think many of them are very committed to trying to make change. And they really want to be able to do it. And so I think we have ways that we can help them, but we have to be cognizant of the political landscape that they're working in and know how to help them in that context.
I wonder, as you say that, Chris, that recognition of the role of leader, I think, is really important, and that shift was important in the field. But I also wonder if we writ large did take enough proactive action to say these good outcomes came from this good process. It was not just the leader, it was the good process, because what I've observed is people see the outcome, but they don't know how it happened. And there's a return to politics as usual the next time around, that there hasn't been that sustained commitment to a collaborative process led by a leader. And we continue to cycle in ways that haven't been entirely productive either for states and communities in our nation nor for the health of the field.
That makes me think of one of the resources that meant so much to me, and that is the work that James Coleman did on communities in conflict. And, what he said at one point, something like, the way a community deals with a problem one time can load the dice for the future. And I think one of the things that we could do, just in response to the point you're making, Bill, is that we could tell our story more effectively, and we could help communities by recalling the times when they have effectively dealt with issues and how they did it. Those kinds of stories can help. I've seen that kind of approach help a community, because they've forgotten that time that they got everybody together and it worked. And then you recall that, oh yes, I remember that. Yeah, there was good feeling after that. We got things done together. Yeah.
What could be some future lines of development of leadership, working on policies in a more collaborative fashion? Are there new opportunities or variations on tools that you've seen in the past that you'd want to put forward for, hey, let's try this, or here's a new opportunity?
Well, I think one of the things that, and this is just, where my mind is currently, so I'll lay it out there a little bit, and then you can see if you want to pursue it or not. I think one of the things that I'm observing is that, you know, things have gotten pretty complex. And, and government, you know, I don't know if you know Jacob's book, Systems of Survival, but government as the guardian class has a hard time breaking out of its silos. And I just think that I'm going to give you an example of a project where we worked on here that made the importance of, you know, you can get people to sit down and agree on what needs to work, but sometimes the net problem is how to actually implement it. And there is a growing need for what are being called a lot now intermediary organizations that either take on the capacity building that, you know, sometimes state agencies are not in a position to do, or either because of the way they operate. Sometimes state agencies, for instance, if it's a financial kind of thing, can't even get money out the door. You know, we encountered that here in Oregon when we had this housing emergency, that it would have taken for emergency housing in case of fires and homelessness, it would have taken the state agency maybe 2 or 3 years to get the money out the door. And we essentially worked with the group, and they agreed to allow the Oregon Community Foundation to do it, and they got the money out the door in 7 months. So, you know, I think one of the things that those of us working in this area are increasingly being called on to do is to figure out the implementation step and how do you set up the mechanism to do the implementation that is going to need to happen to make the solution work.
And that makes a ton of sense, Chris. How do you place that work, which is critically important? If the money doesn't get out the door, people continue to hurt. They don't get the support they need. And a desire to democratize processes, to get more citizens engaged and get more residents who also want to have their say, but that also moves it away towards the sort of a legislative policy frame rather than an implementation frame. And I know they go hand in hand, but sometimes it seems like when we move towards intermediaries, some folks feel shut out of the process.
Yeah, I think it's a real dilemma. I don't have an answer for it. I just think, you know, there has to be genuine public engagement, but, you know, sometimes things need to happen. And, you know, if it takes 20 years to build a bridge to deal with something, because, you know, everybody wants to have their say, in the long run, does that serve the public interest?
Right.
So here's at least a couple thoughts for you. One is, Chris, certainly across the 70s plus in terms of your entry into and development of the field, I want to point out just 2 things and get your reactions to them. Number 1, more women are in power, in responsibilities, in the private sector, in government, in nonprofits. And people argue in general that women would be more collaborative than men. On another angle, though, is the rise of the internet and rapid communication with often incomplete or misinformation, or things blow up and people can't even get ahead of them to be able to deal with something that creates a conflict which really in the past would have not blown up in the same way. So can you speak to either of those 2, at least observations or trends, and how you see how they may affect the field?
Well, I think there are more women practitioners as well. I think that's going to happen. It'd be an interesting thing to watch. In thinking about getting together with you to talk about this, I just looked at the staff of various organizations that do this kind of work, and I would say that many of them are made up largely of women now.
Yeah.
And what was the second part of that, John?
The internet and the, I think, fast communication, but also I'll build on that. Oftentimes people want an answer or they want a solution at internet speed, when I think Bill and I and you would say you need deliberation, you need time to build relationships and trust in order to have that firm foundation. So it seems like this is even more and more in tension these days.
It's a very complex problem and it takes resources. I mean, one of the things with the Divided Community Project that we worked on is, you know, when something happens in a community that causes a conflict, then who is prepared to get the message out so that there's a way that rumors can be refuted and all of that. That takes prior planning and it takes resources to put those things in place. I think that the other kind of, I don't have a perfect answer for any of that. I do think that when people want fast answers, it may be possible to say what can be done in the short term, but what needs longer term consideration. I can't do better than that.
I think that's great. I think that's right, because you need to show that short-term responsiveness, and couching it is, this is the best we can do now, and we need to look for the longer term as well.
Chris, we want to bring this to a close, and I love the way the Carter School has framed this as parents of the field. And we all know there's parent-child conversations that are really important. Speaking as a parent of the field, what do you think we ought to be paying attention to in the coming years as we look toward creating a vibrant and more effective field of public dispute resolution?
I'm not sure that we've ever been very effective at communicating, just as you, I think, said earlier. Telling our story. And I think that it is important to do that. And I think it's important to find ways to communicate about what we are capable of doing. I read an article today that I think was in the Washington Post. It was written by, there was a book out called High Conflict. Do you know that book? She wrote an op-ed and she was talking about a recent experience in Congress.
Yes.
Did you see that article?
Yes.
And I think that, for instance, that circulating pieces like that more widely, getting the word out that there are things that can be really be done to help in times of high conflict. That I think that those are the kinds of stories that we ought to pick up and repeat to get the word out. So I think, in a way, advocacy for what can happen if these kinds of processes are employed. And I think you said it earlier, Bill, saying this was the result and this is why they got that result.
And building on that, it sounds like it's not sexy sometimes, though. This is my metaphor, is people love the finished dress or the finished suit, but they don't want to look back over the tailoring and how it actually literally got knitted together. And yet, if you're going to have another good suit, you need to have that same principles going forward.
I like that article, and I'm dwelling on it because it lays out exactly the steps that were taken that led to the positive outcome. And I think that, not that showing what's inside, showing and making it simple. not jargon, but making it simple. What broke down the barriers to communication in this committee of the Congress?
And it really is a reflection of the breakdown of the institution. The committee was moving in a path that reflected the way the institution worked. And so they have now created a pilot of a way things can work, and hopefully it'll spread back out. And I think what's also invisible, and where your work over the years has been so powerful, knowing some of the backstory there were a number of other institutions helping behind the scenes to make that happen. It wasn't just as simple as a conversation and breaking bread, as the article inferred, but there were lots of other players, and that's the other part of the story that is so important. So.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
What are any final reflections you'd like to offer as you, again, look back at your touching and development of the field, where we are now, where we can go? And I know you already just noted effective storytelling that really can stick with people at different kinds of orientations, language, or reference points. Any other reflections, Chris?
Well, as I looked around at what is actually going on, and the way that people describe people who are in the business of consulting and training and so forth are describing the work they do, it covers a broad spectrum. And I think that, I guess one of the things that I think there's an area where we kind of got wrapped around the axle, and that was how to describe the kind of forum that we want to create where there's an equal ground. And, we have arguments about what to call that: impartial, neutral, transparent. But that is a really important concept when you're trying to get people to get working together across differences, across different perspectives. I mean, the different sectors operate very differently. They see the world differently, and power is an important player in all this. And that basic importance of having this forum where you're not balancing power, but you're doing something to create at that moment an atmosphere where people can make a contribution that's going to be acknowledged and will be important. I think, I think we tied ourselves up in knots about that, and I hope we didn't walk away from it, because I think it's still a very important thing that is fundamental to being able to be effective over time.